Whispers of Ravensmoor by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. The Return. The train to Ravensmoor chugged laboriously through the dense fog, its rhythmic clatter echoing like faint whispers along the iron tracks. Eliza Ferguson sat by the window, her face pale and illuminated by the dim light filtering through the thick morning mist, her heart clenched with an uneasy blend of anticipation and dread. 2 decades had passed since she last set foot in her childhood village, a place shrouded in mystery, burdened by unspeakable tragedy, and etched deeply into her nightmares. The deaths of her parents and younger brother had been marked as accidental, a gas leak that had claimed 3 lives in the middle of the night. But even as a child, Eliza knew there was more to the story. Ravensmoor was not like other villages. Its air seemed alive with murmurs, its fog as much a presence as the people who lived there. And now, returning as a journalist, the whispers felt closer, more tangible. Her gaze drifted to the other passengers on the train, though few remained as they neared Ravensmoor. Most avoided the village entirely. A stooped man in a weathered hat sat near the back, his gray eyes following Eliza. She looked away quickly but couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, not with curiosity, but with something closer to dread. The train screeched into the station, the noise slicing through the suffocating silence of the village. The platform was deserted except for a hunched figure in a threadbare coat. Eliza stepped off, the weight of the fog pressing down on her, as if the village itself sought to smother her return. Ravensmoor hadn't changed. The cobblestone streets twisted like gnarled roots through cottages blanketed in ivy, their woods splintered and warped. Windows peered out like vacant eyes. It was as though time had forgotten this place, or chosen to abandon it altogether. The innkeeper, Miss Winthrop, greeted her with a tight-lipped expression as she handed over the room key. "You'll find your room upstairs," she said, her voice brittle. "Breakfast is at 7, but, well, most prefer to leave before dark." Eliza paused, clutching the key. "Leave before dark? Why?" Miss Winthrop's eyes darted to the window, where the fog thickened. She leaned in, her whisper barely audible. "This place has always been peculiar, but the last few years, it's as if the fog itself carries a voice that calls to those who will listen." Chapter 2. The Looming Shadows. Eliza's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as she retreated from the chapel ruins. The mist thinned slightly, unveiling skeletal branches and broken gravestones along the moor's edge. The chill seeped through her coat, biting at her skin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something far colder was watching her. The ruin lingered in her mind, a place of forsaken rituals and whispered secrets. Its jagged walls had been scarred by time, yet the symbols etched into the stone seemed untouched, as if preserved by some unseen hand. Every step away felt like dragging her body through quicksand, a sense of foreboding tethering her to the darkness. Her destination was the village green, once the heartbeat of Ravensmoor. In her childhood, it had been a vibrant hub of life, children playing, markets bustling, and laughter weaving through the cobbled streets. Now it was silent, oppressive, the air heavy with a history no one dared to speak of. At the green's center stood the well, its stones weathered and slick with moss. Villagers had once drawn water here, but now it was shrouded in rumors, stories, of strange reflections and echoes that didn't belong. Eliza approached cautiously, peering into its depths. The well's blackness swallowed the dim light, offering no reflection, no bottom, only an unsettling sense of endlessness. A sudden rustling broke the silence. She turned sharply, her breath catching as a wiry man emerged from the mist. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He stopped a few feet away, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You shouldn't linger here," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not safe." Eliza frowned. "Why not? What's happening in Ravensmoor?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the chapel ruins in the distance. "The whispers, they find you when you're alone. They promise things, show you things, but it's all lies. They get inside your head, twist your thoughts." His voice cracked, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice to a hoarse whisper. "I've seen people disappear into the fog. They don't come back, and if they do—" He trailed off, shaking his head violently. "You'll see soon enough." Before she could press him further, he turned and disappeared into the mist, his hunched figure swallowed by the gray. Eliza stood frozen, his cryptic warning echoing in her mind. She had grown used to fear in her line of work, but this was different, primal, suffocating. The Raven's Nest pub came into view as she rounded the corner. Once a place of warmth and cheer, it now bore an air of neglect. The sign creaked in the wind, and the windows were dark, their panes streaked with grime. Still, the faint hum of voices beckoned her inside. The smell of stale ale and damp wood greeted her. A handful of villagers sat scattered across the dimly lit room, their faces etched with weariness. Conversations were hushed, their words slipping between sips of beer and furtive glances toward the door. Eliza approached the bar, her boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. "A pint, please," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The barkeep, a stout woman with graying hair, poured the drink without a word. Her hands trembled as she placed the glass on the counter, her eyes avoiding Eliza's. Taking her drink, Eliza chose a corner table where she could observe the room. The villagers huddled in pairs or small groups, their voices barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Eliza strained to catch fragments of their conversations. "Another one gone," a man murmured, his voice heavy with dread. "Hung herself in the barn," replied another. "Same as the others." Eliza's stomach twisted. "Excuse me," she interjected, leaning toward their table. "What happened?" The men exchanged wary glances before one finally spoke. "Aggie Collins. Found her this morning. No signs she was troubled, no reason for it." Eliza's chest tightened. She had known Aggie as a child, a girl full of life, always chasing the biggest adventures. The thought of her lifeless body hanging in the barn was unbearable. "And the others?" she pressed. "How many?" The second man's gaze dropped to his beer. 7 this month," he said grimly. "But it's been happening for years, always the same, no warnings, no signs, just gone." Eliza's mind raced. 7 in a single month was an epidemic, not a coincidence. These weren't random tragedies. They were connected, to the whispers, to the specter, to whatever malevolent force had taken hold of Ravensmoor. She spent the evening gathering scraps of information from the wary patrons. Their fear was palpable, their words tinged with desperation. Some spoke of hearing voices calling their names late at night, voices that sounded eerily familiar. Others described waking to find strange symbols etched into their walls, symbols that vanished when touched. One man recounted a chilling tale of his neighbor, who had been found kneeling in the fog, murmuring to someone who wasn't there. By the time Eliza returned to the inn, the streets were deserted. The fog had thickened, curling around her like smoke. Each step felt heavier, the silence pressing in on her ears. She glanced over her shoulder, convinced she was being followed, but saw nothing. When she finally reached her room, she bolted the door and drew the curtains tight. The inn was silent, but the weight of Ravensmoor's darkness seeped through the walls. As she lay in bed, sleep eluded her. Images of the well, the ruins, and Aggie's lifeless body swirled in her mind. In the early hours of the morning, she awoke to a faint sound, a whisper, just outside her window. Her heart pounded as she sat up, her breath shallow. Slowly, she approached the frost-covered glass, and there, etched into the frost with an invisible hand, was a single word: leave. Chapter 3: The Raven's Call. The morning light was weak, struggling to penetrate the dense fog that blanketed Ravensmoor like a smothering veil. Eliza had barely slept. The word scrawled on her window, leave, lingered in her mind, an ominous reminder that she wasn't welcome here. But leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. Determined to find answers, she made her way to the edge of the village, where Margaret Hallow's cottage sat nestled among the moors. Margaret was the unofficial historian of Ravensmoor, the keeper of its whispered legends and dark secrets. If anyone could shed light on the specter and the tragedies plaguing the village, it was her. The cottage was a sight of defiance amid the gloom. Its small garden was a burst of color against the gray, with hardy blooms that seemed to thrive despite the oppressive atmosphere. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, promising warmth within. Eliza hesitated for a moment, steeling herself, before knocking on the weathered wooden door. "Come in, dear," called a voice from inside, warm and inviting despite the chill outside. Eliza stepped into the cozy room, the smell of herbal tea and the crackle of a fire greeting her. Margaret sat in a high-backed chair, her white hair falling in soft waves around her face. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, met Eliza's with a flicker of recognition. Eliza Ferguson, Margaret said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and certainty. The Moors spoke of your return. Eliza's skin prickled. The Moors? Margaret gestured for her to sit. Ravensmoor is alive, child. It breathes, it watches, and when it feels something, stirring, it finds a way to let us know. Eliza took the offered seat, the chair creaking beneath her weight. I don't know how much you've heard, but I'm trying to understand what's happening here. The whispers, the deaths. There has to be a connection. Margaret's expression darkened. She reached for a teapot and poured 2 cups of steaming liquid, her hands steady despite the gravity of the conversation. This village is old, Eliza. Its roots are tangled in things most people would rather forget. The specter, what you call the whispers, has been here longer than anyone can remember. It doesn't just haunt, it feeds. Eliza leaned forward, her voice low. Feeds on what? Despair, Margaret said simply. Pain, fear, hopelessness. The specter is drawn to it like a moth to flame. It whispers promises, sweet lies that make you think it understands you, that it can ease your suffering. But it always takes more than it gives. And once it has you, there's no escape. Eliza's stomach churned. What about my family? She asked, her voice trembling. Was it responsible? Margaret's gaze softened, but her words were unflinching. I believe so. Your parents were good people, but they carried their burdens in silence. The specter preys on those who feel isolated, who have no one to turn to, and once it finds its way into your mind, it doesn't let go. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Eliza stared into her tea, her thoughts racing. The idea that her family's deaths weren't accidental, that they were victims of something malevolent, was almost too much to bear, but it also gave her a sense of purpose. She hadn't come back to Ravensmoor to run from the past, she'd come to confront it. Is there a way to stop it? She asked, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Margaret hesitated, her eyes distant. It's been done before, she said finally, but it's not easy. The specter's power is tied to the chapel ruins. That's where it's strongest, where it draws its strength. If you're brave enough to face it, you'll need to go there. Eliza's heart sank. The thought of returning to the ruins, where the air itself seemed to pulse with malice, made her stomach twist. But she nodded. What do I need to do? Margaret leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You'll need symbols of hope, of love and light, things the specter cannot corrupt. And you'll need allies. The specter thrives on despair, and it will fight you with every ounce of its strength. But if you stand together, united, you might have a chance. Eliza nodded slowly, the weight of Margaret's words settling heavily on her shoulders. I'll do whatever it takes. Margaret studied her for a long moment, before reaching for a small, leather-bound book on the table beside her. Take this, she said, handing it to Eliza. It's an old journal, written by someone who faced the specter long ago. It won't tell you everything, but it might help. Eliza accepted the book, the leather cool and worn beneath her fingers. Thank you, she said quietly. As she left the cottage, the fog seemed thicker than before, wrapping around her like a living thing. The journal felt heavy in her bag, a reminder of the task ahead. She didn't know if she was ready to face the specter, but one thing was certain. She couldn't do it alone. Chapter 4. The Burden of Truth. Eliza stood at the edge of the moors, Margaret's journal clutched tightly in her hands. The air was thick with fog, and the faint whispers seemed to echo in her ears, just below the threshold of comprehension. She had read parts of the journal throughout the night, the words a disturbing mix of cryptic warnings and chilling descriptions of those who had faced the specter before. They all ended the same: despair, defeat, and death. But Margaret had said it was possible to resist, to fight back. If that were true, Eliza needed more than determination. She needed allies. The village was still, the fog muffling the sound of her footsteps as she walked along the cobblestone streets. Ravensmoor's residents had always been wary of outsiders, but now their fear was palpable, etched into every shuttered window and bolted door. She knocked on the first door, a small, crooked cottage with a thatched roof. The man who answered was gaunt, his eyes sunken and wary. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough. "I need your help," Eliza said, her tone firm but pleading. "The specter, it's killing people, but I think we can stop it." The man's face darkened, and he shook his head. "You're mad to even speak of it. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave. The door slammed shut before she could respond. Eliza stood there for a moment, her jaw clenched. She wasn't surprised, but the rejection stung nonetheless. She moved on to the next house, then the next, but the responses were the same: fear, denial, and slammed doors. By the time she reached the edge of the village, she was beginning to lose hope. But then, a voice called out from behind her. "You're wasting your time," the voice said. Eliza turned to see a man leaning against the wall of a crumbling building. He was tall and weathered, his face lined with age and hardship. Most of them are too scared to even say its name. "And you're not?" Eliza asked, raising an eyebrow. The man shrugged. "I've lived on these moors my whole life. I've lost enough to that thing to know it won't stop until someone does something about it." Eliza stepped closer. "Then help me. If we stand together, we might have a chance." The man studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Name's Thomas Burrows," he said, extending a calloused hand. "If you're serious about this, I'll stand with you, but you'd better be ready. The Spectre won't go down without a fight." Relief washed over her, but she knew they needed more than two people. Together they began visiting the homes of those who had suffered the most, people who had lost loved ones to the Whispers. It was slow, grueling work, and many refused to even open their doors. But by the end of the day they had gathered a small group. Helen Cross, a widow whose husband had succumbed to the Whispers; James Eddington, a farmer who had found his brother's lifeless body in the barn; and Sarah Mills, a school teacher who had seen too many of her students' families torn apart by despair. As dusk fell, the group gathered in the ruins of the chapel. The air was electric, alive with an unnatural energy that set their nerves on edge. Eliza stood at the center, Margaret's journal open in her hands. "We're here because we refuse to let this thing take any more from us," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "It feeds on despair, but we can fight it, with hope, with unity. We can push it back." The group nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They began placing their offerings on the altar, as Margaret had instructed. Helen laid down a photograph of her late husband, her hands trembling. James offered a small carved figurine his brother had made as a child. Sarah placed a bundle of dried flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the surrounding decay. Eliza hesitated before placing a locket containing a picture of her family, her parents, her brother, and herself as a child. It was the last piece of them she had, and leaving it on the altar felt like severing a piece of her soul. The group joined hands, forming a circle around the altar. Eliza began reading from the journal, the words a strange mix of prayer and incantation. The air grew colder with each syllable, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. Shadows began to flicker along the edges of the ruins, shapes that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. "Stay strong," Eliza called over the cacophony. "It's trying to break us, but we can't let it." The Spectre's presence became palpable, a suffocating weight pressing down on them. The shadows grew darker, closing in like a tide. The group's resolve wavered, and Helen let out a choked sob. "We're going to die," she whispered, her grip on Eliza's hand faltering. "No!" Eliza shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not giving up, not now." She squeezed Helen's hand, her own trembling with the effort. The group tightened their circle, their voices rising together in defiance. The Spectre let out a bone-chilling wail, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The air was still, the shadows gone. The group stood in silence, their breaths ragged. For a moment, it seemed as though they had succeeded. But as Eliza looked around, she noticed something strange. The markings on the ground, the same symbols she had seen during her first visit, were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. A low, menacing hum filled the air, and the altar began to crack. "Eliza," Thomas said, his voice laced with fear. "What's happening?" Before she could answer, the ground beneath them shook violently. The glow intensified, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. The Spectre wasn't gone. It was angry. Chapter 5: The Cracks Beneath Ravensmoor. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth's core. The symbols carved into the chapel's ruins pulsed brighter, their eerie glow casting long, distorted shadows. Eliza tightened her grip on the journal, her heart pounding as the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum that filled the air. "It's fighting back." The others stood frozen, their fear palpable. Helen clung to Sarah, her knuckles white as she stared at the glowing altar. James took a cautious step back, his eyes darting to the crumbling walls of the chapel, as though expecting them to collapse. "Eliza, what do we do?" Thomas's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the same unease that gnawed at them all. Eliza flipped through the journal, her hands shaking. The pages were filled with warnings and fragmented instructions, but nothing that prepared her for this. "The specter is tied to this place," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to weaken its hold here, or it'll consume us." The altar cracked loudly, a jagged line splitting the stone's surface. A thick black mist began to seep from the fissures, curling upward like smoke. The mist coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape, its form shifting and writhing as though it couldn't fully exist in their reality. It whispered. The sound was barely audible at first, a faint murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as it grew louder, the words became clearer, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "Why do you fight? We can give you peace. We can take away your pain." Eliza felt the words worm their way into her mind, their tones soothing and insidious. She could feel the weight of her grief pressing down on her, the memories of her family's deaths clawing at her resolve. For a moment, she wanted to believe the specter's promises, to let go of the burden she had carried for so long. But then she saw Helen, drop to her knees, her face pale as tears streamed down her cheeks. "It's right," Helen murmured. "I can see him, my Henry. He's waiting for me." "No," Eliza shouted, rushing to Helen's side. She grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "It's not real. It's lying to you." Helen blinked, her gaze unfocused. The mist around her thickened, curling like tendrils reaching for her face. Eliza slapped her, the sharp sound cutting through the whispers. Helen gasped, her eyes clearing as she recoiled from the mist. "Stay together!" Eliza yelled, her voice rising above the cacophony. "Don't listen to it!" The group formed a tighter circle, their hands clasping with desperate strength. The specter writhed, its form shifting and twisting, the whispers growing louder, angrier. "You can't fight it!" James cried, his voice breaking. "It's too strong." "We can," Eliza said, though her own voice trembled. She closed her eyes, focusing on the memory of her family, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the sound of her brother's laughter. "We have to. For them. For everyone it's taken." The others followed her lead, their faces tight with concentration. The specter shrieked, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down their spines. The mist surged toward them, slamming against an invisible barrier that seemed to pulse with the energy of their collective will. Margaret's words echoed in Eliza's mind. "Hope, conviction, and resolve. Let them be your armor." The altar cracked again, the fissure widening as the mist retreated. For a moment, Eliza thought they might succeed. But then a low, guttural growl emerged from the specter, and the mist surged upward, gathering into a massive column that loomed over them. The whispers turned to screams, an endless, agonized wail that seemed to pierce their very souls. The ground beneath them heaved, and Eliza fell to her knees, the journal slipping from her grasp. The specter's voice was a thunderclap, shaking the very air. "You cannot destroy what has always been. You will fail, as they all have." Eliza gritted her teeth, pushing herself to her feet. "We're not like them," she said, her voice defiant. "We won't give in." She grabbed the journal, flipping to the final page. The words were faded, but she could make out a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. The sacrifice must be given willingly. Her blood ran cold. The journal hadn't mentioned a sacrifice before. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and desperate. They had come so far, risked so much. Could she ask them to give more? The mist surged again, and the barrier began to falter. Eliza knew they were out of time. Clutching the journal, she stepped forward toward the altar. "Eliza, no!" Thomas shouted, reaching for her. But she shook her head, her eyes resolute. "This is the only way," she said. "It has to end here." The specter's form shifted, its whispers turning curious, almost amused. "Do you think you can save them? Do you think you can stop me?" Eliza stood before the altar, her heart pounding. She placed the journal on the cracked stone and closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can stop you," she said softly, "but I have to try. The mist surged forward, enveloping her in an instant. She felt its cold tendrils wrap around her, pulling her into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the faces of the villagers, their expressions a mix of horror and hope, and then she was gone. Epilogue: the weight of silence. The chapel was still. The mist had dissipated, and the altar lay in ruins. The remaining villagers stood in silence, their breaths ragged, their hands shaking. Thomas stepped forward, staring at the spot where Eliza had stood. Her locket lay on the ground, its chain broken. "Did she do it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Did she stop it?" Thomas didn't answer. He picked up the locket, his hand closing around it tightly. The fog was gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness. As the group turned to leave, none of them noticed the faint, dark tendrils of mist curling at the edges of the chapel. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was deafening, and in the distance, the moors began to stir.